Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Iris Drayton-Spann, and welcome to the Women Future Conference 2022. And this is the DEI track that we will be having today for our webinar. And the name of our session is Cultivating an Inclusive Workplace, How Diversity Creates Opportunity. And let me just read a little bit about the abstract that goes along with our session today. And then we're going to get to our wonderful panel I'm going to be talking to about this. So data shows increasing the diversity of your organization will lead to improved innovation, better financial outcomes, retention, recruitment, and individual work satisfaction, as well as engagement. This session will highlight the importance of diversity, inclusiveness, and its impact on company culture, innovation, and performance. So that's going to kick us off and get us started. So I just can't wait to have this conversation with this great panel that I have here with me today. We're going to start around the virtual room, and we're going to start with you, Nicole, if you can just tell everyone who you are, your title, and your organization.
Thank you, Iris. My name is Nicole Mehta. I'm the Assistant Director for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion with Resident Life at the University of Maryland, College Park.
Great, great, great. Thank you. So glad to have you here today with us. Next, we're going to have Itasha, and she will get us started and let us know who she is and where she's coming from and her organization she represents.
Thank you, Iris. I'm Itasha Thurman. I'm the Chief Marketing and Solutions Officer for one of SAP's line of business, the Intelligent Spin and Business Network line of business. I'm really excited to be here today.
Great, thank you, thank you. And last but certainly not least, I will let Lisa introduce herself and her title and her organization.
Hi, first, thanks very much to the Women Future Conference for having us all here. Important topic, so I think we're all very excited. My name is Lisa Edwards. I'm President and COO of Diligent, and I'm also a board member at Colgate-Palmolive.
Great, 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 great to have you all here with us today. And I'm also, you can see in the background, I'm a director of Stanton Chase, and we are an executive search firm that focuses and centers on diversity. I was former vice president of HR and chief diversity officer at WETA TV, one of the top producing public media stations in the country. So transition from that into the executive search space. So let's jump right into this conversation. My first question, and I'm gonna throw it at Nicole first. So how can organizations move away from the one and done diversity and inclusion approach to be a more proactive and ongoing model? I mean, we've seen this, we've read about it, it's top of mind conversation. So I'm gonna start with you, Nicole, if you can talk a little bit about that. What do you think is something that organizations can do with this approach to move from that one and done when it comes to DEI in this space?
Right. I think there's a few things organizations can do to work it into the foundation, right? Like incorporating DEI into the mission of the organization and making it clear how DEI is foundational to the success of the company, right? And how. So whether that's attracting a more diverse client base, increasing access to resources that require some attention to equity, or encouraging more creativity that requires inclusivity, right? So making it clear that if we're not doing these things, we're not at our best as an organization, and setting clear goals that relate to DEI that align with the mission of the organization, right? So everyone in the organization can see themselves in it. There's a lot of resources right now around DEI strategic planning, which I think is a great tool for intentionally building out goals for each team within the organization. So if I'm in IT or I'm a graphic designer, I can still see my specific responsibilities and my connection to DEI in the organization, right? So having opportunities and expectations around individual responsibilities, as well as that group training.
Great, great. Thank you so much. I'm gonna just toss it out to my two other panelists because everyone's coming from a different type of organization. What are you all thinking about this question as well? Because I know, Nicole, you're in education, so you're in higher education. So my other panelists are in for-profit organizations. So speak a little bit about this particular question, is moving away from that one and done and a different type of approach that's more proactive coming from the spaces where you all are working at.
Sure, I can take first.
Go ahead, Go ahead.
Yeah, I think Nicole mentioned one thing that I think is important, and that's metrics, right? Having goals and then measuring it and holding leaders, managers, the organization accountable for that, right? Not just at a high level, this is where we hope to be, but by incorporating that into performance measures and saying your ability to support and create diverse, inclusive, equitable environments is what we look for in a leader and a manager, and we're going to compensate you for that, right? It'll be one of those key metrics. I think, I just don't believe there's altruism in business. I really don't. I believe that what personally affects you motivates you. And the more that this becomes part of the standard for how we look at good leadership, good management, good corporate citizenship, then the more we would really make this more of move from a one-time initiative to how we live, right? How we work, how we show up every day.
Yeah, and
And
I would just
go
pile
ahead,
on a
Lisa.
little bit to both, actually. I mean, I think Nicole has a really good point on the why and making it real for people and connecting it. There's so much data on diverse teams perform better, are more profitable, have higher growth. And it's correlative data to be certain, but but there is a lot of data that shows that diverse teams are better teams. So, I always tell people, do it because it's the right thing to do, but also do it because it's good for your business and it will help you, help you perform better. So I do think that that connecting that why just makes it concrete and real. And then I would just pile on to the metrics discussion a little bit to say, and tie it back to your question on how do you keep it going. I think metrics, many companies think of it as a one and done. So they think of it as once a year, we're going to snap the line, we're going to put it in our sustainability report, and we're going to say, this is how many women we have, this is how many underrepresented minorities we have, this is our LGBTQ representation. And I think that's kind of the wrong way to think about it. I think thinking of it as sort of an organic changing thing can help move the needle along the way. And, specifically, I agree with the underlying concept here that sunlight is the ultimate disinfectant, and so shining a light on these things can be really revealing. And so it's not just looking at percentages; it is looking at percentages that becomes your install base, if you will, to speak in software terms. And then you also need to look at your hires. So do our hiring practices help or hurt those metrics and that install base? And am I getting incrementally better, or am I going to be getting incrementally worse? Same with things like M&A activity. Do those add to or take away from my position on diversity? Then you can look at attrition and say, okay, if your TAM is we've got 40% women, is your attrition 40% or less? In other words, are you staying the same or getting better, or are you getting worse? And if you're getting worse, can you look at the reasons why? Is this voluntary attrition, and perhaps there's something in your business that should be a flag to you that you're not able to retain these populations? If it is involuntary attrition, do you have an issue with specific managers or with a culture that is not welcoming or something like that? So I think there's all kinds of things, but I tend to say it is not good enough to simply measure the data. It's measuring the inputs on hiring, the outputs on attrition, and the promotions. So there's such a huge problem with and I'll call it gender diversity, because I have that statistic top of mind right now. Women graduate from university in the United States at a rate of 60%. Women CEOs in the Fortune 500 are 8%. So what happened in there? And that whole pipeline argument around, the pipeline's not there. Well, guess what? Your educated cohort is disproportionately women. So why doesn't it keep going up? So if we look at those things like promotion statistics, that might help shed a light on it.
Oh, you've hit on a core part of my business. Let me tell you what we do here in executive search, and this is a great conversation, because I think moving to what you're starting to talk about a little bit here, Lisa, the cost of not cultivating an inclusive workplace. So I want to touch on that, because in my business, literally, that's all I'm seeing. That's all I'm seeing. When there's not an inclusive workplace, candidates are reaching out to us because they're going to leave. They're going to leave and they're going to want to be in a place that's going to include them, that's going to help them get promoted, that's going to be welcoming, a great culture, a different type of culture. So I want to pop back over to Nicole real quick on this. What is the cost of not cultivating that inclusive workplace, and especially in higher education?
Yeah, I mean, everyone's talking about the Great Resignation right now, right? And that ties into DEI and how we feel at work. Lisa talked about retention and attrition of staff, and it's also how staff are engaged while they're here, right? Staff performance, staff engagement, staff investment in our organizations. When people feel that they truly belong, that they matter, that their voices are heard and that they're respected, we see more creativity and innovation, right? Willingness and confidence to take on leadership responsibilities and to take initiative. So that increases the efficacy and effectiveness of everyone in the workplace to take ownership of their roles, right? And I think by not cultivating an inclusive workplace, we lose out on all that innovation, that creativity, and how effective our organizations can be.
And I'm gonna pop over to you, Itasha, because as a female woman of color leading the division that you lead at your organization, what happens when you don't have this inclusive workplace? What's that cost of that? And I know you all talk data. I know you and Lisa, you go right to the data and the metrics and the numbers. So talk to me a little bit about that from where you are, the cost of not having that inclusive workplace.
Well, let me tell you a story. I'm gonna shake it up and tell you a story.
Okay.
Instead of giving you a stat. This was some years ago, and I was at a conference, a customer conference, where software companies like to talk about our innovation and how we're helping drive business forward, right? And we had a great conference. It was very, in my opinion, it was very forward thinking. We had great customer engagement. And shortly after that conference, we got a letter that was written, and this was before I was at SAP. We got a letter that was written by the women customers that participated. And they noted that there was not a woman on main stage during the keynote. And they said, this came to our attention. How should we feel about the fact that your whole keynote main stage presentation did not include one woman? And here we are, leaders, decision makers, all females sitting in your audience, and no representation of female leaders, decision makers in your company. We're not sure this is the type of company we want to work with. And if we don't see improvement in this, you might lose our business. And it was so, one, bold. Two, was great to see them come together. Clearly there was some conversation happening in the hallways. But three, it shifted what our company did. So one cost is we had the very real possibility of losing business. Two, the thing I see often, and I can use another example here and then I'll pass the mic, is that you miss the opportunity to meet the market's demand, right? You miss the opportunity to be that brand that the market loves. You miss the opportunity to expand your TAM, right? Your target, your total addressable market, because you're not aware, you don't have enough information, insight on your team to really capture the opportunity out there. And I'm gonna give a great example of, and I've used this before in other talks, of something that was just personally very affecting. And that was over the holidays of last year when Google introduced Pixel 6. And one of the features that they talked about was real tone, and how those people of color who tend to fade into darkness in pictures, right, could now be seen. And for me, it was such an affecting moment, because I cannot tell you how many team pictures, class pictures, I disappeared as a dark-skinned person. And no one ever had thought that maybe I wanted to show up. So the cost is that you disenfranchise people that you're not seeing, and you miss the opportunity that they would give you if you noticed.
Oh, you just dropped the mic there. That was a good one. You just dropped the mic. Thank you for sharing that. That was a great story. I'm gonna pivot to Lisa, but Lisa, I'm gonna add this to you for your question, regarding this particular question. I'm gonna stay on this question for a minute, but from a president of an organization perspective, if you could talk to me from that cost of not having that inclusive workplace, because you sit in a totally different place leading your organization. You are a woman leader, head of your organization. So talk to me from that perspective.
Sure. I think it's a couple of things. I think Atosha sort of touched on. Um, there are so many examples of where not having diverse teams, particularly in things like product design, really cut off part of a customer base. So, if you want to sell into, I don't know, 50% of the population, and having a superior product, that is a helpful thing. So, there's the example that always sort of makes me sort of angry is the crash test dummy example, where there were no female crash test dummies until 2011 for the automotive industry, because they just decided like it was too expensive, and like let's just do the one. And it turned out that women had 47% more injuries in automobile accidents. So sort of like, okay, like now we're killing our customers. But I think there are lots of examples like that where you can open up markets, and you can really design better products by having female teams behind it. Just someone that asks like, hey, what about this? And having diverse teams to the issue of there's a significant portion of the population in Atosha's example that we're just not showing up in photographs. Like, how is that good? And can you have a better product that positions you better, is simply the right thing to do, but also, gets people to purchase your product. So I think that's very much part of it. I would say as a leader in a large organization, we're sort of approaching, 2,000 people now, not nearly as large as SAP, but, in my prior life at Salesforce, I would say there is very much something to, now that, sort of having established the framework that diversity is good, and diversity makes for better teams, better communication, better products, then it's sort of having diversity in some ways. I always say diversity begets diversity. One of the examples that I use is, when I was at Salesforce, I had to hire a CIO, and I went to a recruiter. Wasn't you, unfortunately. And so I think that might have been a shortcut to what I was trying to get at, which was I asked for a diverse slate, and the recruiter came back and said, okay, here's all your candidates. And I looked at them, and they all looked exactly the same, and they were perfectly qualified people. And I interviewed some of them, and many of them were lovely, but they were all 40-plus-year-old white males living in Silicon Valley. And I said, I specifically asked for a diverse slate. Where is it? And the recruiter actually put it, to their credit, put it back on me and said, look, you asked for these qualifications and you asked for diversity, but I gave you all these qualifications. And I said, all right, maybe this is on me. Let's look at the fungible skill set that's needed, rather than, they needed to be at a high growth technology firm having done this. And when I did that, and I opened the aperture a little bit, I found an incredibly qualified candidate. But it was a little bit of a battle. I brought her into the organization, and I said, I want all of you to interview with this person. And I got phone calls saying, wait, this is not from technology. She's at a railroad. Like, we don't, like, we're cooler than that. We don't talk to people from railroads. And I said, well, now we do. And you're going to talk to her. Every single one of the people on the interview slate ranked her as the number one candidate. She happened to be Latina and female. And she came into the organization. She was the longest tenured CIO ever at Salesforce. But not only that, by the time she left, the organization was browner and blacker. It was more female. It had geographically expanded. And just her being there attracted female engineers who wanted to work for a female leader. And I think there's something very real and tangible about that if you can see it, you can be it. If it's not there, you might not want to be involved.
That is, I can't say enough about that. I can't say enough about that. One of the things a lot of our clients ask us for, and that's what I'm so grateful to be at Stanton Chase, is 50% of our slate are diverse candidates, and our diversity runs the whole spectrum. And I have so many candidates that say that to me, especially executive level roles, and that's what we focus on. I don't see anyone who looks like me. And I said, well, let's change that. Let's change it. And I think that is so powerful because you can believe in something when you see it and it looks like you, that mirror back to you. You believe there is space. You believe there is opportunity for you because I'm seeing someone like me, and that is just very powerful, very, very powerful. Uh, I have another great question I want to put out here to the group. So, how do we nurture that existing workforce and instill the value of inclusivity? Because I find, and I know as a former chief diversity officer, okay, how are we taking care of and talking to and having these conversations and making this real in our existing workforce where we are currently so that they understand and get this and they see that it isn't something that's a check the box, it isn't something that's compliance, it isn't something that's, oh, it's going to be nice to do. It is, like you said, Lisa, the right thing to do, the right thing to do. So I'm gonna reverse here and I'm gonna start with Natasha. Let's start with you.
It's a great question, and I think, it takes me back to some of what both Nicole and Lisa said, right? I think one, to create it in the existing workforce, you have to have a reason to believe it matters. And outcomes that, that are tangible and relevant to look forward to or to focus on for the effort, I mean, when you come to this is something I always say, I'm a mathematician by education, an actuary, and then I've moved into business. And I always say a number is just that, but the best way to get people to act is here and here, right? You got to make it real in the heart and the head.
Heart in the head,
So,
yep.
Right, the heart and the head. And so I really think I like what Nicole said about being able to share the impact, what happens when, and then Lisa was followed up with, because it's the right thing to do, and then being able to talk about what we can see, and then celebrating the successes that happen because of inclusivity. And I have to tell you, when I think about inclusivity too and nurturing it, for me, the number one component that must be present is building a culture with psychological safety. Right. So if no matter who I am, if I can bring my authentic self to work every day, then I'm more open to look for the authenticity of my peers, of my colleagues, and support that in coming to work every day. So when I think about how do you nurture it, I think first is creating that environment of psychological safety and then tying back the inclusivity goals to why it matters and what we get out of it, and celebrating that.
Great. And I'm glad you added that celebrate, because a lot of times people forget that it's so important. It's so important for you to stop and celebrate with each other. It keeps people engaged. It keeps them wanting to be at this organization. And especially if I'm allowed to come and be my authentic self and we celebrate things and I'm a part of that celebration, that speaks volumes. That's part of retention. I'm gonna throw it over to you, Nicole. Some examples. Can you give us some examples you want to share of how you all are doing this, how you're actualizing this? Because I think examples are great for everyone to see and to hear and to know, because you can go back and not recreate the wheel. You can just duplicate it in your organization, especially if it's working. So Nicole, if you could share some examples of how you're seeing this.
Yeah, I think it's, when you're talking about nurturing an existing workforce and creating an inclusive climate, those are the same thing, right? And talking about it in that way. Because I think when folks think about inclusivity, sometimes it has a connotation of creating an inclusive environment for these other people, right? When we're really talking about everyone and creating an environment that's respectful and affirming for everyone in the organization. So when we're talking about hybrid work, right, flexible work schedules, all of that is tied into inclusivity. I think when we talk about a diverse workforce and being in leadership roles, we have to understand how identity can influence our experiences and interactions, right? So in higher education, a lot of the leadership still tends to be very white and very male, right? Lisa talked about traditional qualifications a little bit earlier. And academics, you need that PhD to move up, right? And we know there's a lot of barriers to that. So I think it means being cognizant of that in all of the settings, right? So if you have 2 women of color on a team of 15, It means paying attention to who's speaking, how much, whose ideas and voices are being heard and implemented, right? Who's being given credit for different ideas, and giving attention to that and acting on it, right? Because I think that sends the message that we care about our individual staff and also our dynamics as a team, right? Taking on the ownership of I noticed this and I'm going to address it, right? I think it also means being proactive and being inclusive, right? So when we're planning events or large meetings, thinking about universal access from the outset. So we're not playing catch up on the back end when someone makes an accommodation request for a disability, right? We're thinking about that from the outset. So someone doesn't feel like this event wasn't meant for them, that they have to go through these channels, not only to out themselves, but to feel like they need to be accommodated, right? We're thinking about that from the outset to be inclusive.
Great, great, great. Um, so Lisa, can you share some examples of what you're doing at your organization when it comes to, instilling that value of inclusion with your existing workforce? If you have any examples that you'd like to share.
Sure. I think there's a couple of things that, and first of all, apologize, I disappeared for a hot second. We had a little power surge here and
No
everything went
problem.
dark. Um, but I'm back.
Okay.
We do a couple of things. I think, some of the, sort of standard practice or best practice around employee resource groups, for example, and making sure that employees have a cohort that they feel comfortable with. And that can be, everything from people of color to, religions to, people who are interested in, some sport or something. But having those groups, I think, can be incredibly helpful for building camaraderie and commonality. And I actually think it's very important for executives to be involved in those too, and to sort of be the executive sponsor and be visible and supportive of those groups. So I think that's one. I think another that we do is, we try to we try to live the values in making sure that the products that we have are supportive of these types of initiatives. So we've done some director certification and training around ESG, and specifically within their DEI, to show boards of directors the importance of these initiatives and why they should be sort of sensitive to them, looking out for them, making their own boards more diverse, asking these questions of the management teams that they work with, because there's a lot of power in a board of directors being attuned to these things and asking the CEO, tell me about this. This looks like it might be moving in the wrong direction. Why do you think that is? That can be an incredibly powerful interaction. And guess what? Things change after you do things like that. So arming those boards of directors with that certification that shows them sort of how to ask those questions, what questions to ask, why they should care, how this ties back to the performance of the company, and really is a part of not just their sort of moral obligation, but also a part of their fiduciary responsibility, I think can be a really powerful way to approach it.
Thank you so much. I'm thinking as you were speaking, Lisa, on that just the board and different people in the senior level part of your organization, make sure they're a part of this, and it isn't just one person trying to do it by themselves to make this happen, because it has to be everyone, and especially from the top. One of the things they did when I was at the station, just to share, when I was at WETA TV, it was a simple thing that made the existing staffs feel so included. Anyone could pitch a story, anyone. And that was so powerful. That was so powerful. And I would always remind everybody and email everybody like once a month, the whole entire company. Anyone could pitch a story either to the news program or to our national production and to our local production.
Well, that's
That
an
was
excellent
so
point.
powerful. That was powerful.
Yeah, it's super powerful, and it bears sort of underlying that I think where companies get it wrong and organizations get it wrong is they view it as an HR issue.
Yes.
And this
Yeah.
emphatically is not an HR issue. This is an enterprise-wide issue. And it's not up to a person who has some title to make sure. It is everyone needs to own it. Everyone needs to look at themselves and at their teams and at their management styles and their recruiting styles. When you are doing a business plan, it needs to be a part of the business plan. So, I think it's sort of when it becomes ingrained like that, then it becomes part of the natural movement. And, when it is, a person owns it and has to report on it, and if it goes wrong, it's that person's fault. You're doing something not quite right at your company.
Oh, definitely. And I think this is going to lead us to a great part of this conversation, because I've lived it and breathed it. And it can't be human resources. I did that role. It can't be human resources by itself. It can't be the CDO role by itself. It can't just be the chief diversity officer role. It is a leadership. It is leadership because it starts at the top, and all of your employees are going to see what's going on and what's happening. And they're going to see if it's real. They're going to see if you really are doing what you say you're going to do. They're going to really make sure you're following up with, okay, we put this statement out here. This is our strategy, our DEI strategy. They're going to hold you to it. They're going to follow up. They're going to, if they don't tell you, they're going to go on Twitter. They're going to say something on Facebook. They're going to go somewhere and say something to somebody. So I think it's just so important as part of our conversation of making sure this is leadership. Leadership is setting this example, and everyone's looking up to see what they're doing. Everyone's going to look up and see what they're doing. And I'll share another example, because Natasha, you really got me to thinking when you said that about that Google Pixel, because I was one of those people too. I was all in that. I was like, me and my family were texting about it. Can you believe this? When Band-Aid came out with the bandages that were, to the skin tone. And my son was like, wow, I'm going to be able to put a bandage on that looks like my skin tone. That was huge. That was so big. It was that representation. But that takes a lot. I'm getting to the question I'm going to ask next, because someone had to come up with that idea and they had to sell it. And I know what I'm talking about. It's that person who first approached them about, let's do this in Google Pixel. Let's do this at Band-Aid. Let's change this. Someone had to be courageous enough to go to leadership and go, here's this idea I have. What are we going to do with this? And someone has to go, let's move forward with it. So I'm getting to a question about crafting that culture where people feel like they can come, challenge the status quo, and bring new ideas. So I'm gonna open this up to anyone if you all want to talk about that. I'm not just going to go round robin on this one, but I just think about that person that walked in the room and went, okay, we're going to do Band-Aids in different skin tones. So that was someone being very courageous to step forward and challenge the status quo, because they had been selling Band-Aids for hundreds of years, and they sell lots of them all over the world. So I'm gonna leave this to the group, whoever wants to chime in on this, because it's challenging that status quo a lot of times to come in and do something different, and especially, doing it different from a diversity perspective and an inclusion perspective. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll kick it off. I really think it goes back to what I said before. I mean, I think there's two things that I would say, and that's one is having a culture that has psychological safety, right? Where I don't feel like my job is threatened, my future growth is threatened by saying something that's different than what's currently being said or going against the norm. And really, what's the norm? Even having one where a continuous improvement organization and culture is one that fosters that. I started my career at Procter & Gamble. And one of the things that I saw happen as I was starting to leave Procter & Gamble, but there was this conversation among some women employees, Black women employees at P&G, and was saying, man, we make these great products, right? We make these great shampoos, but they're great, but they're not really for our hair. And they pitched the idea, Pantene Gold, right? It wasn't called that then, but look, this is a huge industry. The Black hair care industry is huge. We could do this. And P&G has a culture of innovation. That was there. They created a culture of innovation anyway. And so I think creating psychological, first having that continuous improvement, that innovation atmosphere, and then having an environment that says, bring who you are, right? I think those are foundational. And I think the third thing, and this is harder, and I know personally I'm working to build a stronger version of this in my org, and that's one that's not afraid to fail.
Yes,
You
yes,
know, I
yes.
mean, from an ego standpoint, I really don't like to fail. You know, and I'm an actuary by education, so I'm risk averse.
Uh-huh.
You don't take big bets without risk.
Mhm.
And so, and I do think that in so many organizations, failure is punitive versus being seen as a learning and an opportunity to pivot, right? And the attitude that I'm trying to create is one that failure is stasis, not changing, not growing, not doing anything different. And as long as we're growing and learning, and in that, even that thought, just psychologically knowing I'm safe to grow and learn, well, then why wouldn't I want to also push boundaries? Why wouldn't I be more open to exploring inclusivity, diverse thoughts, right? So those are the three things, you know, that I would say: having an innovative, continuous improvement culture, having and cultivating psychological safety where I feel like I can be counter to current thought. And then the last is knowing that if I fail, that's not the end.
Oh, thank you so much. That's so good. Go ahead, Lisa. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to build on that a little bit because I think that marketing is finally catching up with the fact that there is not a single consumer.
Mhm.
And, I think technology has enabled more segmentation of the customer base. And
Mhm.
I think we recognize that we don't have a consumer. I mean, we used to, in retail, people would say, well, she does this and she does that. Well, who is she?
Mhm.
She may be older or younger. She may be a person of color. She may be white. She may be high income or low income. And I think that sub-segmentation actually helps support what Atosha said, which is we can market. We
Mhm.
can create a product
Mhm.
that really hits a sweet spot for the
Mhm.
customer,
Mhm.
and the customer is not universal. So there
Mhm.
may need to
Mhm.
be a different SKU, and that's okay because it opens up a new area of the business that can be very fruitful. So I think it's definitely technology supported at this point that we can subsegment and we can look at, there are products that are universal and there are products that are more subsegmented.
Oh, definitely, definitely. I just have to jump in here real quick. I'm a love of makeup. I love makeup. And MAC is my like all-time favorite makeup. And when MAC started just showing their inclusivity by having all types of identities wearing their makeup, and I'm always on YouTube now looking at different influencers who promote MAC because MAC promotes them as they are. And I just love it. I'm learning how to do eyeshadow better, the whole 9 yards. But one of the reasons I was so attracted to MAC uh, is because they're so inclusive. They looked at, like you said, Lisa, who is the audience? Who is the consumer? There's so many kind of consumers. And when people see themselves, no matter their identity, they're going to support that. It affects the bottom line of the organization, but I just love it and I'm hooked on it. So I'm not even going to go there. Nicole, any examples of what you all are doing or how that is working when you want to challenge that status quo, and especially in different types of settings, educational settings, different settings like that. Any types of examples. And I keep going back to that psychological safety. That is so important, and being okay with failing and being willing to fail and okay with failing, organizations embracing that. Nicole, you want to jump in on this?
Yeah. I want to start with that piece about not being afraid to fail. I think that was a great point for me, Tasha, because challenging the status quo requires some risk, right? And depending on what it is, those risks have consequences. We have parameters around that. But are there ways that we can work with the goal that's there or the value behind it to get a piece of it? Right? Because I think when someone challenges the status quo, there's a lot of risk in that, especially if they're not in leadership or if they're in leadership but in a minority role, right?
Yeah,
It does take
yeah.
risk. So
Mhm.
if we can understand the value behind it or the goal and get there, even if it's not in that original thought, I think that shows a lot of investment and value, right?
Mhm.
And a commitment from the organization to want to move forward and be more inclusive. Um, I think that it's important to model challenging the status quo at the leadership level,
Mhm.
right? So
Oh,
asking
yes.
questions that ask folks to think outside the norm. Um, and how we model responding when someone does challenge the status quo, right? So especially in the last few years, with the pandemic, with being virtual and hybrid, that is not the norm for a large state university. So there were challenges to the status quo externally and internally, right? And that's just the way things have been done, was not an answer anyone could give, right? So thinking about, one, how are we recognizing the people that are challenging the status quo and modeling, thank you for bringing up this issue. It's important, and I value your commitment to making us better and helping us think differently about this, right? And creating that space for people that you're open to that, especially if it's new or rare for the organization. And building ways to incorporate it into the structure, right? So one of the things we're doing is we're working with a model called the Equity Tank. It's from 3 scholar practitioners who used to work at Towson University up the street from us. And it's about looking at our practices and policies to look at where inequities come up and what are best practices and how we can address those inequities, right? So a process of how we bring small teams together, right? Talking about how this is everyone's responsibility, not just the CDO, not just HR. So we can look at recommendations, get different perspectives, and have leadership's buy-in to move these recommendations forward.
That is great. Thanks for sharing that. I'm hoping that everyone who will be listening to this session of ours is getting some great information, some great examples, some great things they can use and do. And like I said, you don't have to recreate the wheel all the time. We're given a lot of great things that you can implement in your organization. One of the things that we did when I was at the station, we engaged in diversity coaching for our leadership team. And that was something I had to take a risk and just put it out there, because I really, really felt strongly that to model the behavior we wanted to see across the organization, we had to start from the top. And a lot of people at the top didn't even understand this conversation. They didn't understand how to address, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and what do you do and how do you move in the space. So we engaged in 6 months of diversity coaching with a wonderful practitioner, Dr. Kiki Ramsey. She has a firm that does this, positive psychology, and it was wonderful. It was magnificent. And my colleagues at the time were a little scared. They didn't know what to expect. I was the only person of color at the time on the leadership team, and to bring this forth, I looked at it as, I'm gonna be a part of this with you. And I participated in the program with them as we did it. And at the end of it, there were individuals who wanted to continue doing it one-on-one with the coaches, with the diversity coaches. And it was really eye-opening, because it was bringing something new and different. It was challenging the status quo, but I wanted us to be better leaders because everyone was looking at us. So to have these conversations with your team, building in something that's going to help them, prepare them, and give them some tools to have conversations, to look at inequities that were going on in their teams, to look at how they were promoting, to look at how they looked at gender, ageism, and to address all of that in a safe space. We keep going back to that psychologically safe space. And the way we did the diversity coaching is each person had their own coach, and then we had small group sessions. So just throwing that out there too as an example of helping senior leadership and helping leaders see this from a different lens, to, if you want to cultivate this inclusive culture, but also bringing people into your organization and they see that leadership is working on themselves. Lisa, I see you're ready to say something. Jump on in here with me.
I am, and it's really just to agree. Well, first of all, if you do figure out how to put the eyeshadow on, feel free to give me a private session, because I've been trying to figure that out. On the, I just want to like highlight your training issue, because I think there's something important in here, which is, it kind of goes back to my comment about it's everyone's responsibility. I think particularly for the people in positions of leadership, it is really, really important to model the behavior, but also to call the behavior out. So if, we sort of live in a time when, it's time to stand up and be counted. And if you're not part of the solution, you're a little bit a part of the problem. And I'll give a very concrete example from my personal life. I have a husband who is amazing. He is the lead parent. He has now left his job to support the family. He could not be more enlightened about these things. He came home from work when he was working and said, you know, the CEO told this like kind of sexist joke and it was disgusting. And I said, and you called him out on it. And he sort of looked at me and I said, and you said something. And he kind of looked at me and I said, you are part of the problem. And, you know, I think, and he hadn't thought of it that way, and he wasn't the boss. But, you know, I think it doesn't have to be aggressive, and it doesn't have to be, you know, offensive. It can just be a very polite, first of all, let me tell you how that comment made me feel. Or it can be, you know, just a simple correction. You may not be aware of this, but let me tell you. And, you know, I think that, you know, gentle correction is all of our obligation, but it's really our obligation. The more senior you are in the organization, the more able you are to absorb some of those risks and take them on behalf of teams and other people in the organization. So I would just encourage, you know, everyone who is in a position of more privilege in an organization, of higher rank in an organization, to really sort of take it upon themselves. You don't have to, it's not policing the organization, but it is when you hear or see something, you know, I think there is an obligation to say something.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much. So we're about to wrap up our time together, and this time has flown by so quickly. And I want to give everyone an opportunity to just provide one more nugget you'd like to share on creating that how that diversity creates opportunity. Just one quick nugget, if you want to just drop that, as Tasha said earlier, Tasha said earlier, drop that mic moment. One nugget you want to leave for everybody before we wrap up our session.
I can go first, lead
Okay.
us off. You know, I think that just remember, you know, half, sometimes more than half of your customers, sometimes more than half of your employees, certainly half of your community are diverse. And if you can create an organization that looks like your employee base, looks like your customer base, and looks like your community, I think you are always going to be better off.
Perfect. Great.
Okay, I'll go next. I'm
All
going
right.
to give a little bit of a different angle. I'm going to give a bit of advice or my nugget from a little bit of a different angle, right? So it's really thinking about how do we make this sustainable. And so I will say, and I'll challenge all of us, that the burden of diversity is not to HR, and it's not on those considered diverse. I've always been amazed that, you know, companies put in programs to say, hey, we're going to develop women leaders, so we're going to give them more work to do. I don't understand that, and I've always declined. It's hard enough. I don't need more work to try to stay up. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't have those programs, but I'm saying it's not their burden. You know, and the thing to lead with is curiosity.
Yes.
I worked at Capital One, and I had a skip level leader invite me to be a reverse mentor, because he had read an HBR, Harvard Business Review article about diversity and about how to really become inclusive, right? You have to open yourself up to different perspectives. And if you have not had experiences that mirror what the constituency you're trying to bring in and make feel included and welcome, then maybe you should learn more. And he approached me and asked me, would I be willing to be mentored to learn more about Capital One? In exchange, right, from him, I would give him the ability in a safe space for reverse mentoring and share perspective on what it feels like to be a woman and an African-American woman in leadership at Capital One. And I very much value that relationship, and it speaks to their commitment to the sustainability of their programs. So it's not just the burden of those that are diverse, but if you lead with curiosity, it will almost always keep you on the right path.
All right. All right. I'm loving this. I'm loving this wrap up nugget dropping conversation. Nicole, what nugget you want to drop with us before we wrap up?
I'm going to focus on this DEI being everyone's job, right? And I think it has to come from leadership, right? So when we talk about organizations being diverse or organizations claim to be diverse, but the leadership doesn't reflect that, what kind of message that sends, right? We talked earlier about it taking courage to bring new ideas, to challenge the status quo. That courage can come from seeing folks like you in leadership positions, right? That contributes to that. We talked earlier about pipelines, right? I think that creates pipelines that are long overdue to speak to that mentorship and some of that, added labor, as Tasha mentioned. But we know that women and that folks of color often take on those mentorship roles, right? And I think having more diversity in leadership sends the message that this is a core value, and that we're actively pursuing it in a meaningful way by looking at it and paying attention to it at all levels of our organizations.
Great, great. Thank you so much. I am just overjoyed. I'm full of hope. I have some new ideas I'm thinking about too that you all have shared. And I just hope everyone who's going to see the session walks away with a new sense of why it is so important to cultivate inclusiveness in your workplaces and also creating those opportunities for others. And I want to thank my great panel again, wonderful, wonderful women. I'm just so in awe of all of you and just so grateful to have been in this space with you all today and to have this conversation. And just want to thank you so very much. Thank you.
Thank you.